people actually think what they think about a lot of things, and why people are as confused as they are. Now, to introduce the level of confusion that exists here and in every other transatlantic country, I'm going to read from something that was written 40 years ago by a friend of mine who wrote this. The populations of the richest nations of the world, in the Americas and Western Europe, now accept a level of ugliness in their daily lives which is almost without precedent in the history of Western civilization. On one hand, we tolerate the slow deaths of millions by starvation and disease, even in our own nations. Narcotics has become one of the largest industries in the world. The murder rate in America now surpasses that of the Old West. At the same time, we have become inured, used to, in other words, to 1,000 smaller horrors. Our children spend as much time sitting in front of a television set as they do at school, watching with apparent glee scenes of torture and death that might have shocked an audience in the Roman Colosseum. Music is everywhere, but it does not uplift. It rarely even tranquilizes. It claws at the ears, sometimes spitting out an obscenity. Our plastic arts are ugly, our architecture is ugly, our clothes are ugly. There have certainly been periods in history where mankind has been forced to tolerate similar levels of brutishness, but our time is crucially different. Our post-World War II era is the first time in history in which these horrors are avoidable. Our era is the first to have the technology and the resources to feed, house, educate, and humanely employ every person in the world. Yet, when the undeniable facts demand solutions, we are strangely passive, called upon to implement proven technologies to prevent needless death. A majority of our populations are impotent. And that was 40 years ago. The world of 40 years ago compared to today was a paradise. Now, why is it that people don't even think that things are that bad? In other words, you're at a level of not brainwashing. You're at a level of paralysis of the mind in most of the societies of Europe and America, among everybody, including the people that claim that they are bitching about those societies. So even the people that say that they want the solution are powerless to mobilize others who also say they want the solution. How do you get there? How does that happen? Accident? Well, this is why we're going to talk about Edgar Poe. The reason that it is necessary to talk about Edgar Poe is what I just said. Now, the first thing that I need is to get that first picture up. Is kind of doing that? He's going to do that? Okay. Well, that's Edgar Poe. Okay, and he lived in the Bronx from 1846 to 1849. He took a trip at one point to Baltimore, and there he was assassinated. The story about his assassination was written up by the doctor that took care of him, John Moran. But the doctor didn't write it for 40 years for reasons which tend to will be obvious to any of that try to follow the Kennedy assassination, or 9/11, or any number of stories, or the Robert Kennedy assassination, or the King assassination, or the Malcolm X assassination. So here's what the doctor says. He says, concerning the often repeated slander, I here affirm that Edgar uses the name Edgar Allan Poe. You will notice I will never use the name Edgar Allan Poe when I speak. I will say Edgar Poe. He says, Edgar Allan Poe did not die under the influence of any kind of intoxicating drink. The hospital in which Poe died was second to none in Baltimore as to size, comfort, and location. It was known for many years as the Washington College University Hospital, in which hundreds of students daily traversed its wards. I conducted and controlled this institution for 6 years as resident physician. So there's the guy who's in charge of the hospital, okay? So he goes through, he says, just after the death of Edgar Allan Poe, before the lifeless corpse had been cold in the grave, an enemy, an avowed and personal enemy, that's in italics, you make sure you don't miss what he's saying, who became his administrator and was his first biographer, made haste to write and publish the foul lie and falsehood that Edgar Allan Poe died from delirium tremens at some unknown and out-of-the-way hospital in Baltimore City. And strange to say, this man's work, Rufus Griswold's Memoir of Edgar Allan Poe, though repeatedly denied upon the best authority, continued to be much sought after, and its poisonous effects are yet seen and felt on both continents. Indeed, that is exactly what you will read, what people will tell you about Edgar Poe to this day. And it was started from that time. So just to be specific, Dr. Moran says this: Edgar Allan Poe did not die under the effect of any intoxicant, nor was the smell of liquor upon his breath of person. He was in my care and under my charge for 16 hours. He was sensible and rational 15 hours out of the 16. He answered promptly and correctly all questions asked, spoke freely. He told me in answers to my questions where he had been, from whence he came, and for which place he started when he left Richmond, when he arrived in Baltimore, and the name of the hotel where he registered. Okay. And then the doctor presents a review of the evidence, which had been done by the police. He says that arriving in Baltimore about 8 p.m., Poe was followed by two suspicious characters, as the testimony of the conductor will show. When he reached the southwest corner of Pratt and Light Streets, he was seized by two roughs, dragged into one of the many sinks of iniquity, probably a gambling hall, which lined the wharf. He was drugged, robbed, stripped of every vestige of the clothing he had on when he left Richmond, and reclothed with a stained, faded, old bombazine coat, pantaloons of a similar character, a pair of worn-out shoes, run down at the heels, an old straw hat. Later in this cold October night, he was driven or thrown out of the hall or wherever in a semi-conscious state. Okay. Now there's a much longer text that comes from, but the first is just to establish that. Okay, we can go to the next slide. Well, that's one, but there's also the picture that I took, but that's all right. So this is Alan Salisbury. Alan Salisbury was a member of the LaRouche organization. He joined about the same time I did. He had come out of an association with many things, including the Black Panther Party, particularly. There were several people actually at that time around the LaRouche organization that had some association with the Panther Party. And that shows him with a portrait that was done by, I think it was Gary Ganasio, I believe, that portrait of Poe. Can we go to the next? No, what happened to the actual picture that I sent you of Alan?
We'll put it up.
Because I want to, what?
We'll put it up now. Slide 25.
Because you have to see this picture. Now, you may not be able to see that closely, but what you'll see is he is laughing and he is smoking. And he's laughing actually uproariously there because he's at my 10th and Lynn's wedding anniversary. And he's basically giving me a truly hard time. And that was Alan. And that was what he was like. And he was probably, depending on whether or not you can get the truth to be told in history, it may someday be said that he was one of the most important American historians of the latter part of the 20th century. The reason is not because of Poe work, because it was Alan who rediscovered an American economist by the name of Henry Charles Carey. Henry Carey had done an extensive letter exchange and dialogue with Karl Marx. And he had done this because Carey had been the head of what was called the economic section of the New York Tribune. And in that dialogue with Marx, he had attempted to correct ideas that Marx had about the American Revolution and about the nature of what Marx referred to as the proletariat. And the reason he's doing this was because Carey's father, Matthew Carey, had been a pamphleteer for Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin had hired Carey's father when Carey's father was 17. He was Irish, and he got booted out of Ireland. He came to America. Franklin did this with several people, Tom Paine as well. And he had him working in his printing press operation and as a pamphleteer in Philadelphia. What happened was that Matthew Carey, the father of Henry Carey, was the most acerbic is probably the best word, acerbic critic of Adam Smith. Matthew Carey's father, Henry Carey's father, argued that The Wealth of Nations, written by Adam Smith, the famous economist around which supposedly capitalism is all composed, that book was written against the American Revolution. And that was the contention of Matthew Carey at the time. He had a series of lectures that he gave in Philadelphia about this, and the son, who picked up on this, wrote a series of books in which he and his father and a German by the name of Friedrich List became the founders of the school called the American System of Political Economy. The American System of Political Economy really just took the writings of Alexander Hamilton and then built upon those writings and talked about the idea that it was possible to amass capital through a state and to deploy that capital for internal improvements in the state. And for example, the kind of project that they launched was the Erie Canal Project, which was a project which was done through, of course, to connect the Hudson and the Hudson River system westward out to the Great Lakes. And they created that. Now, this was done took a long time to do it. I mean, it was like an Apollo project. It actually took a period of, until about 1825, actually, is when it was completed. It was actually begun by Alexander Hamilton's father-in-law, Philip Schuyler. But Schuyler couldn't complete it because nobody could complete it. It was a project that required a nation. And when they began it, there wasn't even an American nation. Hamilton and Washington later began the process through the first American presidency, because the first American presidency, the first 4 years, the second 4 years, were a revolutionary government. I mean, by definition, it had to be a revolutionary government. It was the first time that anybody was president. They had just passed the Constitution over a 2-year period, and then they were implementing this. And there were 4 documents written by Hamilton at that time, which were developments of documents he had actually begun earlier. He began the documents in 1780, when he was probably about 23 years old. He could have been 21, just about that age. And then he perfected the documents, and they were called the Report on Manufacturers, the Report on the National Bank, the Report on Public Credit, and the Report on the Constitutionality of the National Bank. This created, for the first time in human history, nobody ever had it, a system of banking and credit that allowed the United States to go from a massively indebted nation, massively indebted set of colonies, the 13 colonies, to an orientation to pooling the resources of the country for what were called internal improvements. Today, people talk about things like infrastructure, about roads, bridges, highways, tunnels, dams, and so on. Then they talked about it the real way it is, internal improvements. So that the concept was that, I mean, they didn't have a country. They were trying to unify the country. And they recognized that if you didn't have basic systems, like systems for being able to navigate waterways. For example, the reason that the city of New York became so important was because of the Port of New York. New York City was the center of American manufacturing until 1966. Not Detroit, not any other place that you talk about. The largest number of skilled and also semi-skilled manufacturing workers in America was in New York City until 1966. That's why New York City could have 8 million people in the first place. So the entire conception that people generally have about like what was what and who was who in America is a problem, because most of it has been the product of successful myth and obfuscation in the aftermath of that this of the 19 so the post 1945 post World War appearance of mass media. I mean, you had radio beforehand, but it really was of a different vintage. You know, Franklin Roosevelt's fireside chats of the 1930s, the first one being in 1933 as president, was the first time radio was even used that way. That was the first encounter for most Americans with a personal encounter with the President of the United States was Franklin Roosevelt doing those fireside chats. Of course, not everybody in America had radio. And from that moment, a different relationship was established between the president and the people, but also from that moment, mass media was really essentially developed. Joseph Goebbels in Nazi Germany understood the power of this, and he did a lot of work with radio for Hitler. That was one of the ways that Hitler was able to become the kind of dominant force in Germany that he became. It wasn't the primary one, but it helped. Now that's an important story concerning radio. There are many things that happen as a result of radio. But one of the things, for example, that Goebbels understood was that even the broadcasting of music on the radio could have a brainwashing effect. So, for example, one of the things that happened was that the Nazis insisted on changing the frequency of the use of tuning on the radio. They changed it from A at between 427 to 435 cycles per second to A at 440. Now, the reason was this, in part was, it's true that on battlefields, and even earlier, that when you wanted to have give directions, you can do them with drums, but you can do it also with brass. If you have the brass more highly pitched, then it is true that that sound will travel more clearly. But what was being done by Goebbels was a change in what was called the scientific tuning. I reference this because this organization in the 1980s did a campaign to restore the tuning of music to the middle C at 256 cycles per second. That translates to an A at between 427 and 435. Now, why is that significant? Well, because what was done with radio by Goebbels then became a project which was called the Radio Research Project. This was largely based at Princeton University. If we can go back to the slides, I think we've got T.W. Adorno up there. Yeah, that's him. Theodor Weissengrund Adorno. All right, now this guy you will hear mentioned by people who have no idea who he actually is, but they think they do. You'll hear it all over the place. You know, people talk about something called critical race theory, which they don't even really realize comes from critical theory, which is largely the product of Adorno and his friends, not only him. There's other people, but I put him up there because he's relevant to the story we're telling and the specific element of the story concerning tuning question. He ran the radio research project, and sorry, he ran the radio research project, and he also ran a thing called the study called the authoritarian personality. Now, the authoritarian personality story is critical to our story because the idea of leadership that people have throughout the United States, and when they talk about of anti-authoritarian leadership, let's take a person like a Donald Trump, but you can take a lot of others, right? The notion of Hitlerian personalities was a thing that Adorno's study, which was a large-scale sociology study, established in the aftermath of the Second World War. Now, the reason this is relevant is because his radio research project and his studies of the authoritarian personality were directed in the following way. Now, I will date myself, but I have no problem with this. Top 40 radio, which was a phenomenon that was created in the late 40s and 50s, was invented by this guy. Here was the thinking. The notion was that what you needed to do is that you had to democratize culture. Because one of the big problems was that Western civilization was authoritarian. It was authoritarian because, for example, of the monotheism of Christianity, or the monotheism of Judaism, or the monotheism of Islam. Because anything monotheistic is by definition authoritarian. Because you're saying there's one God, and there's one God with one set of laws, and you either with that program or you're not with that program. So obviously the thing is authoritarian. Okay? So he said, so now what you got to do is you got to find a way to democratize the present society, but if you try to attack the religions, it's not going to work. You've got to figure out a way to secularize the culture and to create the notion of a cultural pluralism. So, here's what we're going to do. We're going to create something via radio. And what we're going to do is we're going to begin to shape, but don't have to do it, just say it, musical tastes. What you need is you need compositions which are short, and they are pluralist. So that's what they did. And so the notion, that's how the 3-minute record got invented. Today, this is not that meaningful to you necessarily, but it was very meaningful in the 1950s. All of the things, the 45s as they were called, this is where they came from. In other words, you say, well, wait a minute, what do you mean people weren't just doing that? Well, of course you could find young people who would do things, but the issue was how did these things get promoted? How did they get played? Who plays them? How does this work? So this is the guy who researched this, and so what they were doing, they had to do different experiments with it, and they did these during the 1950s and 60s. So I reference him because the reason he's significant is because the campaign was to erode the idea that there can be singular individuals that can shape the way in which societies should be changed. He wouldn't necessarily be against, let's say, some scientist who has some invention. Say, well, that is one person that has the idea, therefore that you have to abide by that. But the notion that one person can direct a society, or that individuals may be right when majorities may be wrong, that's got to go. Got to get rid of that idea. That it's possible, in other words, to have a situation such as in the United States Senate, where 99 senators are wrong, and one is right, and that he or she stands up against them in the form of the filibuster. That's what the filibuster was originally for. So that if you were the only person standing, as long as you can stand on your feet, you can talk, you got the floor. See, now that's a Republican idea. Now, when you say republic, we're talking about form of government. We don't mean party. We're talking about the idea that you can have a situation where a single individual in a society who understands that everybody else is doing the wrong thing stands up and says, no, we're not doing this. For example, that's what the theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer did in Nazi Germany, who's just become Nazi Germany, but he did do it. This was in the period of March or April of 1933. He was 27 years old, and Hitler had just come into power in January 30th, and then on February 27th, 28th, there was a fire in the German parliament, Reichstag fire, and Hitler, as chancellor, said, I need emergency powers. And at that point, that's when, and the parliament voted him emergency powers, and after that was over. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, opposing this, went on radio and gave a radio broadcast denouncing Hitler. It was cut off in the middle, toward the middle. And he went out on the street together with friends of his, leafleting his address. He had to be removed from Germany at a certain point, but when he went back, he was part of the resistance, the so-called bomb plot against Hitler. He was executed in concentration camp, but his point was that he had to do what he had to do and that he stood up as an individual. In Adorno's world, you don't want to have these kinds of people, because these are the kinds of people who, under certain circumstances, grab a society because the moral authority that they have, which is based on something that's internal, cannot be allowed to rule, in that if you do that, then you don't have a pure democracy. Now, there's a lot to what he had to say. That he wrote many different books. It would take a long time to talk about him. We're here to talk about Poe, but there's a reason we're talking about him. Pluralism. Okay, now, here's what I want you to do. If you can go to the Purloined Letter slides, the ones with the actual writing. Okay, now, I'm going to read to you this. If you go on the internet, I'll read this off. This is a story that Poe wrote. And it's a story, it was not the first of his stories. He was the inventor of what people call the detective story. I mean, everything you think about with Agatha Christie or any of these other things that you know, he invented that. And he invented this over a series of stories. They weren't called detection stories, actually. They were called tales of ratiocination. This is a term that just means reasoning. It doesn't merely read, but it's a form of dialogue or dialectical reasoning. Murders in the Rue Morgue is one of those stories. Purloined Letters is another one. There's a story called The Mystery of Marie Roget. There's a story called The Gold Bug. There are all these kinds of stories. So if you go on the internet and you look this story up, here's what happens to you. I'm going to read you one version. It was just after dark one windy evening in the autumn of 18 I was with my friend Charles Auguste Dupin in the library of his Paris apartments. For 1 hour at least, we had been sitting in profound silence. Dupin seemed content just to watch the smoke rising from his pipe. As for myself, I was thinking about the affair of the Rue Morgue, the other story in which they were trying to solve a murder. More particularly, I was thinking about how quickly Dupin had solved the case when the police could do nothing. It was therefore something of a coincidence when our old acquaintance, Monsieur G of the Paris police, arrived at the door. G, we call him Gilles, explained that he had called to consult us, or rather to ask the opinion of my friend, about some official business that had caused a great deal of trouble. What is the difficulty now? I asked. No more murders, I hope. Oh, no, nothing like that. The fact is, the business is very simple indeed, and I am sure we can manage it ourselves, but I thought Dupin would like to hear the details of the case because it is so very odd. Simple and odd, said Dupin. Okay, that's the first version. Can we get the next, go past to the next version? I think it's going to be marked for you. Yeah. Second version. Same story. One evening in Paris during the autumn of 1845, I went to visit a friend, Auguste Dupin. We were smoking our pipes and talking when the door of his apartment opened. Mr. Germain, the head of the Paris police force, came into the room. I came to ask your advice, Germain said to my friend Dupin. I am trying to solve a very important case. It is also a very simple case. So I really need your help, but I thought you would like to hear about it because it is so strange. Okay, that is the same story. You heard what you heard before. You hear it now. Same opening. My men and I have worked on this case for 3 months. Germain said it's a very simple case of robbery, but we still cannot solve it. Dupin took the pipe out of his mouth. Perhaps the mystery is too simple. Okay. Let's go to the next. Okay. Okay. Now this is the actual version as it appeared when Poe did it. At Paris, just after dark, one gusty evening in the autumn of 18 I was enjoying the twofold luxury of meditation in a meerschaum, it's a drink, in company with my friend C. Auguste Dupin, in his little black library or book closet, au troisième, number 33, Rue du Nord, Faubourg Saint-Germain. For 1 hour at least, we had maintained a profound silence, while each to any casual observer might have seemed intently and exclusively occupied with the curling eddies of smoke that oppressed the atmosphere of the chamber. For myself, however, I was mentally discussing certain topics which had formed matter for conversation between us at an earlier period of the evening. I mean, the affair of the Rue Morgue and the mystery attending the murder of Marie Roget. I thought upon it, therefore, as something of a coincidence when the door of our apartment was thrown open and admitted our old acquaintance, Monsieur G, the prefect of the Parisian police. That's what Poe wrote. Why does the internet have two additional versions of this story? Why has somebody gone to the trouble of rewriting this? I mean, it's internet. What's the problem? If you don't want to read the whole thing, then you can, right? What would be the significance of making sure that people don't read that version? Well, now we are in a different realm. And this brings me to why we are here or what I'm interested in doing. Let's go to the next thing. I think this may be Lynn now. Actually, go to Lynn. Well, yeah, let's go past the slides at the moment to just go to the other text, if you have it there. And I'll begin to read from it. Fenimore Cooper, that's it. Yeah, don't worry that it's going to be big. If you make it bigger, it's fine. So here's what I want to, what I'm about to read comes from Lyndon LaRouche. Let me say something about him in relation to Alan Salisbury. Okay, so this is written by LaRouche in 2005, I think in November. Alan was working on a book on Edgar Poe, which he had begun right after he finished his work on the economist Henry Carey. And this was back in 1977, 78, 79. What had happened was that LaRouche had co-opted Alan onto the leadership of our organization. Sort of a longer story, but what happened was that this was a period when the organization was revolutionary socialist / communist. Okay? And so at that point, there had been a big dispute about what Alan had discovered concerning Henry Carey, because what he was saying about Carey was right and Marx was wrong. And that was heretical to say at that time in our organization and in general, in the 1970s. The general perception was that the American Revolution, if it was important at all, was a bourgeois revolution, which was an inferior revolution to the ones that Marx would talk about and that Lenin would make. That was simply the way that people generally thought. And if you were to talk about the American Revolution as being somehow superior to that, that was sort of, nobody even thought to make that argument. The reason Allen was looking at Carey, the reason he found it, was because in the original investigation, he was trying to trace the relationship between Karl Marx's International Working Man's Association and its support for Lincoln, which it did. Marx supported Lincoln during the period of the 1861 to 65 conflict, called the Civil War, but should be called the War of the Rebellion, of the Southern Rebellion, because there was no actual Civil War. Lincoln did refer at some point in 1863 in the Gettysburg Address to a Civil War, but he never referred to it prior to that time as a Civil War. He never accepted the idea that the South had any right to secede. He always thought about the country as a unity. That is, Lincoln was an authoritarian. And that he believed the idea was that the country had been established as a unity, and no section of it could secede and be regarded as an independent nation state. He never did that at any point. And that's the reason he also demanded the unconditional surrender of the southern states. But, as I said, Karl Marx had supported the 1861 to 65 conflict because there was a very, very large German population. Well, in the United States, actually, to this day, the largest percentage, if you want to start talking about ethnicities, the largest percentage of Americans have come from German extraction even to this day. That's probably not going to be true in 5 years, but it was true up to that point. So what we have is this. So they were writing a book. What happened was that LaRouche and Allen decided they would write a book about Edgar Poe. But the reason that they would write a book about Edgar Poe was because the idea was that the American intelligence had to be reorganized. The notion was, how could you replace the Central Intelligence Agency and the 17 additional intelligence agencies? Something which happens to be apropos to at this moment right now. So, for example, without taking too long on the matter, because I want to get to what Lynn says, to understand what the nature is of what the America was that was actually founded. Because that's the way to understand Poe, because Poe was a grandson of the American Revolution who knew he was a grandson of the American Revolution. So you can't understand his writings. You can't approach him as a, quote, artist. You can't understand why he was assassinated. You can't understand why they would continue to character assassinate him by putting false expressions of his stories up. You can't know any of that unless you have a good idea of what is happening in America today. First of all, there is no such thing as American intelligence anymore. There's only British intelligence. And virtually everything that is being done by the United States comes out of London and has since approximately 1947 to 62. Now, that wasn't completely true until the assassination of JFK. But the way this was done was through the educational institutions and particularly the English departments. If you want to understand the CIA, you have to look at the English departments and the philosophy departments of American universities over against Cambridge and Oxford. If you look at that and you just trace the people, look at who James Jesus Angleton is. Look at who the people who led the agency are and look at their pedigree. Look at the departments they come out of. They come out of classical language departments and English departments. That's where the killers come from. Why is that? Well, that's why we're discussing Poe. We're discussing it because what's not understood is the nature of language.
What's not understood, for example, is that if I can control the terms of discourse, I can indirectly control the content. But more importantly, I don't have to control the content. It is not necessary on the internet to put content to control you. It is necessary for you to use it constantly for you to be controlled. And that's all it's needed. So these are things, however, that wouldn't be understandable. They're not approachable. They're not available because they're not taught. So let's take a few examples of this, not in terms of the contemporary American thing, but that, because Blinken or these other people are illiterate. Blinken's taste in music is what tells you why he would go to nuclear war. It's his guitar playing, which tells you more about what he thinks than any other element of discussion. So I want to just read this. This is the same here, but I realized it was going to be small. This was from a section of an article, and it says Fenimore Cooper, Allan Poe, and Lafayette. And again, it should say Edgar Poe, not Allan Poe. And that's right, Lynn had it wrong too. That's right. Here's what it says. The original intelligence service of our United States of America was in principle headed by the principal founder of our republic, Benjamin Franklin. However, the continuation of that intelligence function was concentrated in the hands of an organization of the hereditary order of the veteran military officers of the American Revolution, the Cincinnatus Society, headed by George Washington and the Marquis de Lafayette. So it had a domestic arm and it had a foreign office. The foreign office was headed by the Marquis de Lafayette. James Fenimore Cooper, who's a writer, was an outstanding figure operating under his cover as a writer in this field, as was the Edgar Poe, I'm going to say, who retired from West Point for reasons of his epilepsy, served as both a counterintelligence specialist inside the USA and in a deployment with Lafayette and Cooper in France. The writings of Cooper and Poe are read with some relevant familiarity with the names in which they were written. If the writings of Cooper and Poe are read with some relevant familiarity with the times in which they were written, they belong to the same general category of what the great artist and historian Friedrich Schiller identified in himself as the work of persons who were both world citizens and patriots. Then he just said, this is Linda's autobiographical thing. He says, I can affirm with some authority from experience that whether inside or outside of formal intelligence services of the USA, all true intelligence professionals of the USA whose work I have come to know were, like Cooper's spy, individual patriotic men and women who, like my late friend Max Corvo, have developed an inclination and knack for the craft. I'm going to make a comment about this. And Lynn, I may have you say something about the issue of Cooper, certainly at the end. What's Lynn talking about here? He mentions Max Corvo. So let me tell you that story because it will help explain what is happening in Washington today. Max Corvo was in charge of a section of what was called the Office of Strategic Services. It was the precursor to the CIA. Lyndon LaRouche got to know him in the 1980s. And Max told us about how the nuclear weapon was actually dropped on Hiroshima because he was one of the negotiators. What he explained was that the surrender of Japan had been fully negotiated by June of 1945. And one of the chief negotiators of this was the Cardinal Montini that would later become Pope Paul VI. It was all done. Max was involved as well. But then a decision was made in the aftermath of Roosevelt having died, he died in April, to drop the bombs anyway. Eisenhower objected. He was the supreme commander of the Allied Expeditionary Forces. MacArthur was asked about it and objected. Even George Patton had second thoughts about it, which give you an idea how unanimous the situation was. But the bombs were dropped. And as Lynn used to say, why did we drop 2 bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki? And then Lynn would answer his own question. He said, because the only 2 we had. So the thing is to understand that something was being done by the dropping of those bombs. Now, Oliver Stone has discussed that in his Untold Story of the United States. And he and historian Peter Kuznick, we can bring that up at the end of the class, discussed it on television at the point that that series first came out, I think within 2012. They did a show on Democracy Now! And we can bring that up for you. Historian Peter Kuznick was also a member of this organization, and he and Stone wrote the book and did the series. And what Stone tells as the story, and Max Corvo knew as the story, was that the Soviets had assembled an army of 1 million people, which they turned from west to east and were able to redirect to invade Japan. And they would have been able to invade Japan were that necessary by no later than the end of August of 1945. The bombs were dropped in order to prevent them from doing that invasion. See, now this is important because the story is told by Americans and others. Well, the reason the bombs were dropped was so Americans would not get killed if they had to invade Japan. Americans didn't have to invade Japan. There were 1 million people assembled by the Soviets who were very happy to do that. So Max Corvo told this story to LaRouche, and in the course of some years then, they, well, it wasn't only they, but others, started to begin to think, we got to do something about this present monster, which is the American intelligence community. So Allen was already in that sort of disposed that way, and he began to do some work on this, but he died of cancer in 1992. The book was never done. Sections of the book were completed, but the book itself was never completed. And at a certain point in approximately 2005-06, Jeff Steinberg from our organization began to take this task up again and asked that some people help to do that. So I'm going to read. Let's go past to the next section. I'm going to probably go past something here. Okay, I'll reference this quickly. Just read it quickly, and then I want to get to something here. The characteristic of the work of such early figures of our intelligence services, as notable in the case of Cooper, James Fenimore Cooper, and of German historian Friedrich Schiller, as it is for me, is the emphasis on the importance of treating the continuing influence of the innately imperialistic Venetian financier oligarchy, which spawns today's lurch toward a form of empire called globalization, and that Venice's political intelligence networks as a benchmark for study of modern European history in general. There's no competent study of the medieval or modern history of European civilization which does not pivot on the study of the character and methods of the Venetian financier oligarchy and its Anglo-Dutch liberal financier outgrowth, viewing that financier oligarchy and its cultural characteristics as an echo of the legacy of the Delphi cult of Apollo and of the famous hoaxer and Apollo cult high priest Plutarch and his ancient predecessors. Here's what I'm going to tell you about this. Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice and Shakespeare's Othello are discussions, both of them, of the Venetian intelligence services. Othello's clearer because Iago's very clear. And that is the method by which they work. And the story is actually quite clear if you read it, because I'll told you really in the first opening discussion that Yaakov has. He's been passed over for a commission. He's pissed off, and he decides that he's going to do something about it. He's about 28 years old, story, and he does it. And the play is simply an unfolding of this using Venetian methods, so that he makes Othello see ghosts. I reference that because there's a work by Friedrich Schiller called The Ghost Seer. You can take a look at it, which is an extensive discussion of this idea of Venetian methods. There's a lot of things could be said. We're not going to do that today because that's not what we're here, except I will reference that Poe did write a poem about Venice called The City in the Sea, which begins, lo, death has reared itself a throne in a strange city, lying alone far down within the dim west, where the good and the bad and the worst and the best have gone to their eternal rest. It just begins that way. It talks about we may even go through it later, but he was very aware of this. He also wrote a story called The Assignation, which is also about Venice. And this was a theme that also his friend James Fenimore Cooper also covered. Now, LaRouche has said something here, many things there, but let me say something about Babylon and Persia, because if you want to understand the issue of British intelligence in America, that's what you have to look at. Babylon, the Persian Empire started about 550 BC. At the point that it began, Babylon was already a fully established imperial system. Their primary export were gods. What they did was they manufactured gods, and they manufactured cults. And they did that for the Persians. They created an imperial marcher lord society, which society was intended to, on their behalf, conquer particularly the areas of the Aegean, and even into the Mediterranean if they could get there. So, of course, there was no Greece as such. There was Greek, and there were the city-states of Greece. What happened was there were some colonies on the western side of modern-day Turkey, which were Greek, which were basically all gutted and destroyed as part of the Ionian civilization by the Persians. This happened about 510 to 500 BC. The Athenians, Thebans, the Spartans, others understood that the Persians were coming for them. Various people tried to come up with different ways of preparing for that. The Spartans did what Spartans tended to be known for doing. They tried to get ready militarily, but the Athenians did something different. There were a group of them that did it. They basically invented what we know today as Greek tragedy, with particularly Aeschylus, known to us to have done this. And their idea was what they had to do is they had to somehow break the hold in Greece of the Babylonian created gods and cults. So they wrote a set of plays to deal with these themes, like the Prometheus and other plays written by Aeschylus. Now, a lot of his plays are lost. I mean, he wrote over 90 plays. Most of them we don't have. So there's not a way for us to know that much. But what we do know is that on the epitaph on his tomb is, "I fought at Marathon." It is not, "I am a great playwright." There's a reason for that, because what needed to be done, and the issue was to get rid of superstition in the minds of the citizens, and to also have people recognize that there were flaws in themselves that they had to confront, as well as flaws in the society. But the notion was a form of public education that was done in the amphitheaters. It was done by pulling people together into a theater, and you'd put on a drama, and you'd have, 3, 4 actors, whatever. You had masks. I mean, you didn't really have costumes in the way we think about it. It wasn't all the kind of accoutrement you see in all these Hollywood things. It's all just a few people and they would change masks. And it was necessary for the imagination of the audience to conjure in their mind what was being portrayed to them by these actors. Now, I'm not saying the actors are not skilled. They had to be very skilled to do this. But the purpose is the intent of drama. The intent of this was to allow for the audience to reflect on their circumstance by seeing that circumstance projected to them. And then to be able to, see what the mistakes are, or for that matter, what the resolution was. Now, in Shakespeare's time, the same was true. Shakespeare's Hamlet, for example, is a message to Elizabeth, among other things, about her flaws as a leader. And the other dramas were similar. Shakespeare was highly political, but he didn't write political dramas by writing screeds, which are propaganda sheets, the sort of crudity that you pretty much have in the 20th century and you have the 21st century. He didn't do that. If to write things which show great figures being destroyed by some flaw, not merely within themselves, but maybe it's a flaw that exists in the society as a whole that they won't address because they want to be like everybody else. Maybe that's the problem. You see, the issue of the idea of the republic, as we talked about earlier at the beginning, the issue is, what if you see that the society as a whole is flawed and you have to do something? Are you permitted to say, I'm too small to do it? Are you permitted to say, I know what to do, but nobody's going to listen to me? Well, the society will permit you to do that. So what is the internal process that one would go through or could go through to make some sense of this? I think we go to the next section and then we'll be finished with this. Now I want to say a few things about Poe and then we'll sort of draw this section to a close. No, it's next. Go past that, I'm sorry. The aspect of intelligence work, you see that? I'm sorry, I may have to go back. Strategy, yeah, you're getting close. Hold on. I have a sentence, I think. Well, that's all right. Let me just read it. The aspect of intelligence work which I am reflecting in this report is best identified as strategic intelligence. As I've emphasized in a series of published writings on relevant matters, strategic intelligence begins with the study of pre-Aristotle ancient classical Greece. Mastery of classical Greek would be helpful, but not strictly needed in modern times, when relevant specialists in that ancient language of Plato and his contemporaries are still available in significant, if not strictly adequate doses. The essence of a culture lies not in the dictionary meanings, which might be assigned by mere grammarians, but as I have shown in relevant reports, in the state of mind, which in this case, the ancient classical Greek writers of relevance expressed by their use of their language. Mere words cannot supply us the meaning of words. Meaning lies in a higher and deeper realm, in the realm of cognitive processes of which words are merely the footprints of passage. I want to read that sentence one more time. Mere words cannot supply us the meaning of words. Meaning lies in a higher and deeper realm, in the realm of cognitive processes of which words are merely the footprints of passage. In fact, strictly speaking, one person cannot directly convey an idea to another. I'm saying that. One person cannot directly convey, not with words, an idea to another. I have to try to find something on my phone because I didn't bring I unfortunately don't have my iPad. Incommensurable. Just give me a minute, I'm sorry. I just have this. I found it. This is something that happened. LaRouche was in jail for 5 years, got out in 1994. My wife can tell you something about that because she was on trial with him. And when he got out, what he wanted to do is to rebuild our intelligence capability. And he was having a conversation. This was in 1995. And he was unhappy about what we were producing. And he had this to say in a talk. This goes to this issue of words. He said, all intelligence work is premised on the method of Plato, that is, the method of change, epitomized by the problem posed in the Parmenides dialogue of change, no change. You are searching for something which has no name. What name are you going to put in a computer to find it? All intelligence is creative work in the sense of the one-many relationship described by Plato. How do you define something that you don't know the name of? And he says that's something called an incommensurable. You take two or more values which are not the incommensurable, you try to box in the area where the incommensurable lives, which consists of everything you know about the area defined. The area among a set of values, not on a set of values. Now I'll give you an example. Right now in the United States, this week, what's actually happening is that the United States is about to give all of its nuclear weapons to Great Britain. Now the way it's going to do this, which no one's going to tell you about, but we know, is a thing called the Mutual Defense Agreement. The Mutual Defense Agreement of 1958. Now, 1958, what's the big deal about that? Well, we had a meeting today of the International Peace Coalition. And these meetings are starting to grow, and a lot of people are getting onto the meetings. And these are people who were opposed to our organization, who are suddenly getting on. Ted Postal being the most notable, who just swore up and down he would never get on a meeting to be in discussion with us. And he was very happy to be on today, as were some others. There were about 1,000 people on live today from what we can tell, although I'd say more like 800 is knowable. We don't really advertise these meetings, and what's beginning to happen is the kind of phenomenon that you want to have happen. So this week, what happened? Well, Biden, or the collective Biden, because there is no Biden, put out a letter on July 29th requesting that the Congress of the United States would basically ratify an arrangement in which a treaty, which was not a treaty, it never went through the Congress formally as a treaty, which is called the Mutual Defense Agreement, would become permanent. That is, it would no longer be subject for review by the United States President or the United States Senate or the United States Congress. Now there's a problem. The problem is that the prosecution of war is supposed to be in the hands of the United States Senate and the United States President, not somebody else. But if you pass this law, as was said by a British operative by the name of Malcolm Chalmers, who was with a thing called the Royal United Services Institute. It's the largest, the oldest of the intelligence services of Britain. He said, well, what's good about this is then that means that no president can interfere with it after you basically say it's permanent. He just said it straight out. It's simple. That's why you do it. President can't do anything. Senate can't do anything. It's just law. What the law allows is that any form of intelligence on nuclear weapons is going to be jointly shared with the British. Well, where does it come from? Well, for 10 years, that was illegal from 1946 until 1958, roughly about 10, 12 years. There was a thing called the McMahon Act that was passed after the war. The reason it was passed was because America had a nuclear capability that no one else had. And although other people had helped to acquire the nuclear capability, the notion was that this has got to remain within the control of the United States. Therefore, Canada and Great Britain were cut out. Well, the British were unhappy about this. And the Foreign Secretary of Great Britain, Ernst Bevin, said, we have to get in on this. We have to put a Union Jack on this weapon. So they proceeded for a period of years to work on the atomic bomb themselves. Eventually they got one, but the reason they got it was not to have their individual capability. They got the bomb so they could argue with the Americans that they should have access, because now they basically have built a bomb. So what you wanted down to is have a joint program. What happened was that got proposed. Eisenhower, for reasons which are not clear to me, basically went along with this. And July 3rd, 1958, the Mutual Defense Agreement was begun. Now, it used to be reviewed like every year. And it was every 5 years. And it was every 10 years. And it's been every 10 years for a while. But now, it's supposed to become permanent. Now, you could say, and you would be correct, well, wait a minute, why is a big difference since it's getting re-upped every time? What's the big difference in making it permanent? Difference is that once you've done that, now you have shifted the relationship of power and you have accessed, by a foreign power, all capabilities you have in this realm. Now, Shoigu, who is the former defense minister of Russia, is looking at that. Maria Zakharova, the spokesperson of Russia, is looking at this. Putin is looking at this. So this thing, which actually doesn't seem to have much significance, actually has great significance. It has qualitative significance. So even though it's been there the whole time, and it seems to be a virtually dimensionless change. No, it's not that. It's decisive. Now that's intelligence work. It doesn't mean that and we found out something else. One other thing I should say. If you look up the articles about this, all the articles tell you it's a done deal. That is, there are articles in Britain that say, well, this has happened. Keir Starmer, it says, has created a situation where the entire nuclear capabilities of Great Britain are now all unified with America, and Britain is no longer free. That's how they're covering it. Okay? Here's an article that does that. I'm not blaming the authors. Starmer permanently ties UK nuclear arsenal to Washington. Exclusive. Britain's nuclear weapons are now forever reliant on US military scientists after a transatlantic treaty was quietly rewritten. Okay. Poe. Well, Poe was born in 1809. His grandfather was the assistant quartermaster of the Revolutionary War Army. His grandfather and his grandmother made about 500 uniforms for the American Revolutionary troops. And Lafayette was in charge of the units. Or actually, Lafayette was actually the commander of the Continental Army, which should be said at a certain point, particularly in the southern districts. Lafayette who was leading the diversionary attack. Well, it wasn't diversionary. He was creating diversion at Yorktown, at the end of the war, because Washington and other people had to get down there. They had a complex operation. And so Lafayette was a personal friend of Poe's grandfather. When Lafayette came back to America in 1824, exactly 200 years ago, this past August, he went to Virginia and he looked for David Poe, but he was dead. Actually went first to Baltimore, which is where he went to find him first. found that he wasn't there, and he then went down to see Poe's grandmother. And he met Poe there. Poe acted as the commander of the honor guard for Lafayette for his trip in 1824 in Virginia. Poe would later go to West Point after this. Now, there's a lot of things that are important about 1824. We're not going to go through a lot of that now, except to say one thing. Lafayette's mission to America, and remember, he was the head of the Society of the Cincinnatus. I didn't say much about who they were, but what they were was they were supposed to be the veterans from the American Revolution. They called themselves the Society of Cincinnatus after the Roman consul who became dictator and who had defeated the enemies of Rome. They called the Equi, I think, something like that. They were attacking Rome from the east. And he defeated them in 16 days. He was made officially dictator. That's the term they used. And he became notable because he willfully gave up power and went back to his farm. He had been consul in 560, I think it was, 560 BC, 2 years. And he'd given up his consul service. So that was an official position like Roman Senate, but council. But then he was called back into service because they needed him to lead the military attack. He did the same thing about 20 years later. I think it was 19 years later. I think it was 539, I'm sorry. Let's see if we get this right, 560. Yeah, but it was 20 years after the first attack. And there was an attempt internally in Rome to do a coup against the government in Rome. They called him out of service again. He did the exact same thing. So on two different occasions, when he could have held dictatorial power, he refused to do that. The Society of the Cincinnati was born in order to prevent that same thing happening in America, because pretty much as the war began after Yorktown was 1781. The Treaty of Paris that ended the American Revolution was 2 years later. But in between that time, once the war was won on the battlefield, troops wanted to be paid, and they couldn't be paid, not what they were actually owed. And there was mutiny that began, and there was a call for Washington to become dictator. And Washington refused to do that. And George III had said, if Washington refuses that, he will truly be the greatest leader of our time. So the Society of the Cincinnati was the veterans. And Washington was the head of it for America, and Lafayette was the head of it for France. Lafayette was very close to Washington because Washington was about 25 years older than Lafayette. And when Lafayette first came to America, Lafayette brought his own troops, paid for his own ship, and he equipped everybody. So he didn't show up asking for anything. He didn't even show up asking for a commission. They gave him a commission, but that was only after or as he got involved in the actual fighting. He was wounded. What was that? Was that Brandywine? I think he was wounded in 1777. And then he was with Washington at Valley Forge, where a fifth of the army either froze to death or died of various diseases at the time. So Lafayette and Washington were almost like joined at the hip in that sense. He was adopted by Washington as a son. And Lafayette's good other friend was Alexander Hamilton, with basically his same age. And these are guys that we're talking about like in their early 20s, 21, 22 years old. They had another friend who was slightly older. He got killed later, so people don't know his name now. His name was John Laurens. He was the son of Henry Laurens, who was the head of the Continental Congress and the government at the time. And the three of them, Lafayette, Hamilton, and Laurens, were aides to Washington, and they were there at Valley Forge, and they spent a lot of time debating and discussing what would happen to the country. And one of the major issues that they debated and they discussed slavery. Specifically, John Lawrence had the idea of creating black Revolutionary War military units, as did also Hamilton. It wasn't that there weren't black people who were in the revolution. There had been earlier, but then there was a big kerfuffle about that from the Virginians, who of course were slave owners, and Washington prevented the organization of those units for a period of time after they were originally in the revolution at the beginning. 1775, 1776, they existed. And then what happened was when Valley Forge occurred, the guys from Rhode Island got an idea. Their idea was, we can work out a thing, because there were people that didn't want to serve in the military. So the question was, well, if we send somebody in our place, that's legitimate, right? So Washington said yes. And so what happened was a group of people up there said, how about we send some black people in our place? And that's how the first regiment, got sent from Rhode Island. And they came there, and what happened was that it was still a question about whether they should be there. But since they were there freezing to death for Washington, and that's how John Lawrence and Alexander Hamilton began to have, with Lafayette, had this discussion. Now, this is important because Lawrence tried to go to South Carolina, where his father had bequeathed him land and slaves. So he went down there to organize these people into a military unit, and was met with, shall we say, severe opposition. So severe that the people there said to him, if you try this and this goes through, we will give Charleston to the British. Okay? That's the kind of thing that happened, okay? Just to understand. And I tell these stories because American history is way more interesting than you might think concerning the battles and the discussions that were going on all manner of matters. But Lafayette was the center of this because Lafayette was the one who was pushing Washington largely on this matter. Now, when they came here, can you get, oh, there it is. No, it isn't. Can you get me the Lafayette book that's on the table? I'm going to just read you guys something so you hear what the discussion was in Virginia, okay, 1824. What happened was Lafayette goes down there because he goes to every one of the states. And what happens is that they're going around. He's with a guy named Levasseur. This is just Lafayette's picture, but he had one guy with him named Auguste Levasseur, private secretary to General Lafayette during his trip. And so they discussed, I just have to make sure I get the right. Here it is. So they're down there talking to people who are 50 years removed from the American Revolution, and they're asking them about their forms of government and about their histories. So when they get to Virginia, this discussion happens. This crime by which a man, misusing his strength and his understanding, subjects to his whims or to the satisfactions of his needs another man less educated than he, and reduces him to the condition of slavery, was perpetuated in Virginia in 1620. It had as perpetrators the misery of the colonists whose wearied and ill-fed bodies could no longer make the soil productive, and the avarice of the Dutch, who delivered to them, like beasts of burden, some unfortunate Negroes whom they had stolen in the sands of Africa in order to sell them later. The English, no less eager for silver than the Dutch, soon turned to this abuse of power, which fosters idleness as a source of wealth, and they hastened to exploit it to their profit, and from that time their vessels poured out thousands of slaves annually on the American continent. Nonetheless, the sentiments of humanity that famine had for some time stifled in the hearts of the Virginian colonists, revived with the return of fortune and plenty. What they're saying is that when they got the farms working, in about the year 1680, the General Assembly of Virginia requested of the parent state of England that it finally put an end to this commerce in human flesh, infamous and unnecessary in the future, since now the population was numerous enough and active enough to cultivate a land that required only the lightest work to reward the tiller richly. Other colonies repeated this cry of justice and philanthropy, but the parent country was callous and responded only by this atrocious resolution of Parliament. The importation of slaves in America is too lucrative for the colonies to be able to insist that England renounce it forever. That's in italics here. This response was accompanied by threats to which it was necessary to succumb, since they were in no condition to resist them. Nevertheless, the General Assembly renewed several times its demand, which had the different result of obtaining an act by which the importation of slaves to Virginia was hit with a rather large tax in 1699. While this was not a remedy for the evil, it was at least a palliative. Okay? So that Virginia was trying to abolish slavery in 1680, 70 years after it existed. Who told you that? You know that, which you can't unless you go to original sources. You can't find it. That's intelligence work. That's what we're here to do. So here's my conclusion. The idea that we have is we'd like to finish Alan's book. We'd like to do this because we want to be able to take guys like Larry Johnson and Ray McGovern and people like Ted Polstol and people like Larry Wilkerson and these guys. I mean, you know, the most active people we have around us right now we're talking are from Pentagon, CIA, you know. Okay, so our idea is this. Okay, let's take this opportunity to reintroduce the idea of reorganizing the entirety of American intelligence. Just throw all of this stuff out. Now, we realize what that sounds like. I understand what it sounds like I'm saying. But you must make that revolution in the United States if you are to save the United States. But to do it, you've got to give people an idea of their actual history. You got to do something like the Greek writers of tragedy did. You got to hold a mirror up to the people so that they can see the mistakes, but they can also see that they were someone else or supposed to be someone else. You're supposed to act a different way. The Bronx is the best place to initiate something like that because Poe's house is 3 miles from here. One final thing about that. Poe, at the end of his life, had worked on this study called Eureka. And don't want to take this up at all now. I just want to reference it to you so you know. And he said this about it, what he was trying to do. He said, it is with humility really unassumed, it is with a sentiment even of awe, that I pen the opening sentence of this work, for of all conceivable subjects I approach the reader with, the most solemn, the most comprehensive, the most difficult, and the most august. What terms shall I find sufficiently simple in their sublimeness, sufficiently sublime in their simplicity for the mere enunciation of my theme? He says, I design to speak of the physical, metaphysical, and mathematical, of the material and spiritual universe, of its essence, its origin, its creation, its present condition, and its destiny. I shall be so rash, moreover, as to challenge the conclusions, and thus in effect to question the sagacity of many of the greatest and most justly reverenced of men. Now, see, people try to tell you that there are no American intellectuals. Oh, there's none that weren't getting killed or assassinated like Poe, but that doesn't mean they didn't exist. And so this was written in the Bronx. His Eureka was written right up here, 3 miles from there. But I would venture to guess that virtually no one, either at the top of American intelligence presently, or even the retired people, has any clue about Edgar Poe, their ancestor, Revolutionary War ancestor, and his role as an intelligence agent. Okay, so the idea is to never, or at least I don't do this, so it's not, realize I did something you may not have seen before, but I don't give classes that are just about like, it's a passive thing, hey, here's what it is, here's what I'd like to say, what do you think? I don't believe in that. Because I actually don't believe in the classroom. That's one of the reasons I don't do it. I believe in what Socrates did. I believe that the idea is that philosophy or ideas are always active. I think you have to have classrooms. I'm not saying you shouldn't have them. But I don't believe that the people that are sequestered in universities are necessarily where the address where thinking takes place. I don't think that those are addresses where thinking necessarily takes place. I think the very idea that you attempt to foist on the people, the idea that that's the case, is itself an operation against their intelligence. And so this is why some of us have for a long time, and I don't get into a big thing, and oh, I've been doing this for 50 years. Well, yeah, I've been doing this for 52 years, it's true. I don't care. I mean, I didn't make that decision in that way. I didn't think of it that way. I thought about it as making a revolution when I started doing it. I bet the revolutionist people at that point, that's what they said they wanted to do. Seemed to me, well, since you don't really know if you can do that, best way to do that is to live that way. Don't talk about a point where you're going to make a revolution, because you don't know when that's going to happen. You can assert that you'd like to do something. Sure, everybody would do that. But the only thing you can really do is live that way. Then, if you end up dying in a year, or you end up dying in 70 years, you live the way that you asserted, you thought society should be organized. That may not, and it's not that that's adequate. I didn't say that. But at least if you then are cut down in that battle, or you fall because of disease or old age or whatever it is, you fall forward. And society falls forward with you. Now that's what Edgar Poe did, that's what he represented, that's what my friend Alan Salisbury was trying to investigate, and I think that's what should be done. Okay, so I'm going to conclude with that. Any questions or anything else, fine, but that's what I wanted to present.
There were a few things that came in online, but I'd like to give privilege to the people here in the room first, if anyone has questions here.
For observation, that'd be questions. Sure.
I'm simply asking for this treaty or soon law treaty between the US
and Great Britain
to repeat this.
Yes.
Impact, or why is it so impactful? I didn't get it.
Yeah. Well, it's not that it's the treaty; it's the idea of making it permanent. There should be no permanent relationship between, like for example, if you were told that there was a weapons treaty between China and Russia, in which China was going to share all nuclear information or selected nuclear information with Russia, that were announced today. I mean, there'd be press conferences all over Paris, Berlin, right?
Okay. And why is the British here the upper hand?
Oh, well, because why did Iago have the upper hand against Othello? Will you know the play, Othello? Oh, okay. Well, that's the issue. Well, Othello's a great commander. He's of African descent, and he is commanding the armed forces events. He's just won a significant victory, but he has an ensign, a subordinate who is pissed off at him because he's going past him to another individual, and he's not promoting him. So what Iago does, James Iago, is he manipulates Othello to believe that his wife, Desdemona, is being unfaithful to him. And he does this by creating a situation in which an article of clothing that Othello has given her, that he said she should never let out of her sight, is stolen by Iago. What happens, I think he has his wife tell her she's going to clean it or something like that. But he basically gets hold of it. So then what Iago does is he basically starts to say to Othello, I think I see something going on here. I think she's still going out with this other guy. And so Othello said, no, not do that. And Iago just keeps working. He says, well, there's a lot of, I don't know. I'm completely loyal to you, so I wouldn't tell you that if that wasn't the case. So they go back, and then Iago says, wait a minute. Didn't you give her a handkerchief? And she, right? And Othello says, yeah, it's important. Why don't you see if she has it? And now the seed of doubt is in Othello's head, deep. And he asks Desdemona, and basically she's embarrassed because she doesn't have it. She doesn't know where it is. And so she just lies about herself. And he can tell by how nervous she is and the fact that she can't produce it. So he draws the conclusion that Iago is telling him the truth. It's called the Venetian method. The way it works is you think you're in charge. You think you are drawing a conclusion which you have absolute certainty has to be true. And that conclusion you are drawing is exactly the opposite. It is precisely by doing that. In other words, you create in your mind a certainty which is the opposite of the truth. Okay, so let's take America. Right now around the world, people will tell you, America is like kicking everything, forget it. It's the American empire. The American empire is the problem. Get ready. There is no American empire. None. There is no American empire. What there is a British empire that has appropriated the United States. How was that done? Through a set of multiple assassinations. It was done around nuclear weapons and nuclear policy. That by 1958, and this just got released 3 years ago by Daniel Ellsberg, who became famous in the 1970s. He released this document that showed that the United States had an official plan to use nuclear weapons against Taiwan and the Soviet Union, or not, China and the Soviet Union, supposedly around the issue of Taiwan. And they were going to kill 600 million people with the weapons. Now, the material was still classified, and he didn't release it for 40 years. Well, actually, even more, because he had the material from 1972. So if he didn't release it until 2021, it was almost 50 years. And he didn't say he released it because it was declassified. In fact, he was releasing material that apparently was still classified, but he was trying to call attention to the fact that the United States was involved in fomenting a nuclear war against China. Now, listen to what I'm about to tell you. In March of this year, the United States supposedly reorganized its nuclear posture to say that this is now the new Biden doctrine of March of this year, that it would fight a three-front nuclear war against Russia, China, and North Korea. There are several people that have written about this. You can look this up all over the place. A lot of people are talking about it. Whereas when Biden was running for office in 2020, the assertion that he made was that he was going to return to the notion of no first use. He wanted to actually have written no first use of nuclear weapons by the United States. But instead, we have something completely other than that that's happened. Now, how does this work? Well, look at Russiagate, and look at how Russiagate was done, and look at the people that were involved in Russiagate. And they are Sir Richard Harrington, and Sir Richard Dearlove, excuse me, and Hannigan is the other guy's name. They are both military intelligence MI6. And those were the people that first gave the information to the CIA, supposedly about Trump being in collusion with the Russians. This was back in 2016, actually 2015 it began. Let's take something else. The Iraq War, 2003. How's it happen? 10 Downing Street dossier comes from Tony Blair. That's the dossier from which, and this is the famous thing about the 16 words from George Bush. I think I can probably find them, where he says the British intelligence has established that Saddam Hussein was getting yellow cake from Niger to produce nuclear weapons. That's the basis for the Iraq War. About the first Iraq War.
I have them here.
Just stay.
The British government has learned that Saddam Hussein recently sought significant quantities of uranium from Africa.
Okay. And that was the basis on which the Iraq War was done.
And what can they do now better?
Well, I'm getting that's what we're doing. Margaret Thatcher claimed that it was she that put iron in George Bush's spine to go to war against Saddam Hussein in 1991. The Operation Desert Storm, as it was called. That Bush was going wobbly, as she said, and she visited him and put the iron in his spine so that he would conduct that war. In 1999, Tony Blair, Chicago Board of Trade, gives a speech about what he calls responsibility to protect. He says, the days of the Treaty of Westphalia are over. What we now must do is to go to the idea of responsibility to protect. What does he want? He wants Clinton to get involved in a war in Yugoslavia, right, against Serbia and so forth and so on. Okay? So that's 4 cases.
Churchill.
Well, the Churchill thing is off the hook because, of course, he gives the speech, right, the Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Missouri. I mean, what's wrong? He can't just give it at home? And that's the other thing, right? That's a whole, and the Iron Curtain, that's a whole other, because Iron Curtain is a term that a combination of people in Germany, but it was Joseph Goebbels that actually coined it or used it. The Iron Curtain referred to the curtain that comes down as like in a theater, right? That were like it's like a firewall. That's what they were. And it was Goebbels that first used that. He was using it in 45. He was using it earlier than 45, but he was using it several times in 45. Then
in the context that it's used today?
Yeah, sure. I'll find it for you right now. I have all this stuff in my notes, gentlemen. I like to keep it in quotes because it's great when you have that. Yeah. So and I cite this because let me get it here. I think it is this. Yeah. Okay. So you can find this in Final Entries 1945, The Diaries of Joseph Goebbels. The translator is Richard Barrett. And so he does a translation of Goebbels' diary entry of March 13th, 1945. the year before Fulton, Missouri. And he's talking about the Red Army overrunning Romania. That's the context. This is what he says, quote, "These are the old Kremlin tactics. As soon as the Soviets have occupied a country, they let fall an iron curtain so that they can carry on their fearful, bloody work behind it." Okay? And then on Saturday, March 17th, another Goebbels entry just saying, "The Iron Curtain has descended on the fate of Romania." Okay? On March 18th, Stalin has long since let down the Iron Curtain. Okay? So the Churchill use was from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe. Okay, that's Churchill. Okay, that was 1946.
And when were the original
think there
ones
was
of
some other
Goebbels
question.
published?
1945.
45.
That they were written and published too?
Wait, well, there were his entries. Oh, you're saying if like Churchill had read the entries?
Yeah.
Well, we don't know whether he had read the entries, but here's what we do know: that the people that remember Goebbels is in. Well, Goebbels, of course, had killed himself, but the diaries were in the possession of people. I don't know whether there have been translations, okay, because the translation itself is later. It is the translation was published later. But the relevant point here is that besides Goebbels, we just also say, there's a guy named Count Schwerin von Krosigk. There was the Reich's finance minister. The point is that he used the term too. It was a general term that was used. It wasn't new. It wasn't like it was started getting used in 45.
Yeah, okay.
Okay. It was a way that it became known in 46 after Churchill was using it. But it wasn't a term that was used. It was used among anti-communists for whom Russia was the major boogeyman, as was true for Churchill. That's what it was. Remember that Churchill was an avid and a public supporter of Mussolini. He was opposed to Hitler because he was opposed to the Germans. He was cool with Mussolini. That wasn't the problem. I mean, you can look at, and that's easy to find because actually Mussolini, well, longer story, but he thought that he was surrendering to the British when he was on his way to his final resting place at the gas station where they hung him upside down. He had all these files and he was going to negotiate with the British as when he was driving, and he was intercepted because they had, he knew that he had real support in England, which was not true. That Churchill, there were people in London that supported Hitler, but Churchill was not one of those people. He had been very clear about that from the mid-1930s. Yeah. You said there was something else they got? Or did you say there was another question? I mean,
I'm curious you said you wanted to initiate a completion of Alan Salisbury's book, and I knew some of that story, but the way you laid it out, particularly explaining the significance of Salisbury's discovery as being a very essential sort of branching point in the history of LaRouche's organization.
right.
It seems to me that the continuation of that particular legacy would certainly be called for. And I'm curious what the state of his book was, what he had reached in his research, and if you have any understanding of how that project was projected in his mind.
There was an outline that was done that exists. There was an introduction to it that Roosh did. It exists. There are two Salisbury articles, of course, that you've seen, or two actually. And then there are some notes for others. I think there's a third that was completed. But the outline for the book also involves some other researchers. So it was assumed that other portions of the book would be written by other people. So what we would be able to do was just take the outline and then just get some people that would want to help research this stuff and do it. Also, since that time, there's a lot of stuff that's come out on Poe, which would help because there's just more that's known. So I think the way you would do it is you contact a couple of the other people that were supposed to be researching it, see if they did any work. But the main point would be to be clear on the lines of investigation. Like, for example, if you looked at the thing in the Bronx and what he did in the Bronx, there's some interesting questions to be asked just about who he was talking to here in the United States, who he was talking to. Like Washington Irving was one person he may have been talking to here. There's other individuals that we could look at. That's one element of it. Somebody, actually I think it was Bill Jones, has established that Poe was aware of Schiller, and he actually used one of Schiller's poems, I think, at the beginning of the research. Yeah. So he, and there's a lot of things with Poe that get interesting to look at in terms of what he, and you'd want to trace him down. For example, his whole thing regarding it, university. He does a story called Mystification, but it's set at Gurney University. Why? So there are things like that could be done. And so you get a lot of people doing sort of 3 levels of research. One would be basics, just tracing stuff down, which would be very helpful because it would save a lot of people a lot of time. Second thing would be why, looking at his literary criticism, because he had a lot of enemies and he wrote a lot. He also had a lot of people that he was writing, because he ran, as you know, like a Southern literary messenger. Different times he was in a position of actually at the forefront of that kind of stuff. So that was the other thing. And then the third thing is just his method of thinking, which is the most important. How did he write these stories? Why was he writing them? Like, I guess you were looking at the case of Mary Rogers. Were you looking at that? Somebody was looking at that. Well, yeah, that he apparently solved a real murder case, the mystery of Marie Roget, and he was looking at newspaper clippings in New York, but he changed the name of the victim so that it would be partially fictionalized.
You mind if I ask a follow-up on that?
Go ahead.
Just that, I'm wondering if, so that example you picked it's funny because the first one kind of seemed authentic, like I don't know.
There's the purloined letter.
The 3 examples, and then the second one was like a 3rd grade version of the story, and then the third one he's like, it's basically the same thing. Or I mean, the exposition is very similar, and then he says, "Yeah, I was sitting there talking to myself," basically, right? I mean, like there's more to it than that, but that seems to me to be the thing that was taken out of both, among other things. He said, right? I was in a dialogue with myself.
Mentally discussing.
No, he said he was mentally discussing.
Right. So
he wasn't in a dialogue with himself.
Mentally discussing.
Look at Murders in the Rue Morgue. You know Murders in the Rue Morgue? Okay, no, he wasn't mentally discussing with himself. He was mentally discussing with Dupin. They just weren't talking.
Right.
Yeah, you should read them, just that beginning when they're walking down the street.
You mean
Is that
about
from
the?
it? Yeah.
No, well, there's something to
Where
say
is that?
about that. No, wait, that's in Murders in the Rue Morgue.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so I'll read you this, and then there's the point about this, actually, because of the fact that Poe really did this, according to Alexander Dumas. I'll read you first of all the Murders in the Rue Morgue. There's a dispute about whether or not Poe ever went to Europe. One of the reasons there's a dispute is because if he did, then you have to change the whole narrative about who he was. He got a letter which was written for him by Sylvanus Thayer, the president of West Point, because he wanted a commission in the Polish army. And it was written, the letter was given to him. And so there is a dispute as to whether he served in Poland or not. But there is also a story or a writing by Alexander Dumas.
It's a picture of Sylvanus there, right there.
Oh, yeah, great. All right, so here is the thing that happened in the story. I'm going to just read you this. Okay, here it is. All right. So this is in his story, Murders in the Rue Morgue. You don't know this, so I'll just read it. We were strolling one night down a long, dirty street in the vicinity of the Palais Royal, Royal Palace. Being both apparently occupied with thought, neither of us had spoken a syllable for 15 minutes at least. All at once, Dupin broke forth with these words. This is a quote. "He is a very little fellow, that's true, and would do better for the Théâtre des Variétés, the theater of variety. There can be no doubt of that," I replied unwittingly, and not at first observing, so much had I been absorbed in reflection, the extraordinary manner in which the speaker had chimed in with my meditations. In an instant afterward, I recollected myself, and my astonishment was profound. "Dupin," said I gravely, "this is beyond my comprehension. I do not hesitate to say that I am amazed and can scarcely credit my senses. How was it possible you should know I was thinking of..." Here I paused to ascertain beyond a doubt whether he really knew of whom I thought. "Of Chantilly," said he. "Why you pause? You were remarking to yourself that his diminutive figure unfitted him for a tragedy." This was precisely what had formed the subject of my reflections. Chantilly was a cobbler of the Rue Saint-Denis who, becoming stage mad, had attempted the role of Xerxes in Crempillon's tragedy, so-called, and been notoriously pasquinated for his pains, meaning he'd been ridiculed. "Tell me, for God's sake," I exclaimed, "the method, if method there be, by which you have been enabled to fathom my soul in this manner." In fact, I was even more startled than I would have been willing to express. "It was the fruit seller," replied my friend, "who brought you to the conclusion that the mender of souls was not of sufficient height for," he's about the cobbler, Chantilly, "was not of sufficient height for Xerxes." "The fruit seller, you astonish me. I know no fruit or whatever. And then Dupin says, "The man who ran up against you as we entered the street. It may have happened 15 minutes ago." I now remembered that, in fact, a fruit seller carrying upon his head a large basket of apples had nearly thrown me down by accident as we passed from the Rue, so it's such a street, into the thoroughfare where we now stood. But what this had to do with Chantilly, I could not possibly understand. There was not a particle of charlatanery about Dupin. Quote, "I will explain," he said, "and that you may comprehend all clearly, we will first retrace the course of your meditations. From the moment in which I spoke to you until that of the rencounter with the fruit seller in question. The larger links of the chain run thus: Chantilly, Orion, Dr. Nickel, Epicurus, stereotomy, the street stones, the fruit seller. There are few persons who have not at some period of their lives amused themselves in retracing the steps by which particular conclusions of their own mind have been attained. The occupation is often full of interest, and he who attempts it for the first time is astonished by the apparently unlimited distance and incoherence between the starting point and the goal. What then may have been my amazement when I heard the Frenchman speak what he had just spoken, and what I could not help acknowledge that he had spoken, which was the truth. He continued, "We had been talking about horses, if I remember right, just before leaving the other street. This was the last subject we discussed. As we crossed into this street, a fruit seller with a large basket upon his head, brushing quickly past us, thrust you upon a pile of paving stones, collected at a spot where the causeway is undergoing repair. You stepped upon one of those loose fragments, slipped, slightly strained your ankle, appeared vexed or sulky, muttered a few words, turned to look at the pile, and then proceeded in silence. I was not particularly attentive to what you did, but observation has become with me of late a species of necessity. You kept your eyes upon the ground, glancing with a petulant expression at the holes and the ruts in the pavement, so that I saw you were still thinking about the stones, until we reached the little alley called Lamartine, which has been paved by way of experiment with the overlapping and riveted blocks. Here your countenance brightened up, and perceiving your lips move, I could not doubt that you murmured to yourself the word stereotomic. You continued the same inaudible murmur with a knit brow, as is the habit of a man tasking his memory, until I considered that you sought the Greek derivation of the word. I knew that you could not find this without being brought to think of atomies, and thus of the theories of Epicurus. And as when we discussed this subject not very long ago, I mentioned to you how singularly, yet with how little notice, the vague guesses of that noble Greek had met with confirmation in the late nebular cosmogony, I felt that you could not avoid casting your eyes upward to the great nebula in Orion. I certainly expected that you would do so. You did look up, and I now was assured that I had correctly followed your steps. But and he goes on, but in the bitter tirade upon Chantilly, which appeared in yesterday's newspaper, particular one, the satirist, making some disgraceful allusions to the cobbler's change of name upon assuming his role, quoted a very peculiar Latin line, upon whose meaning we have often conversed. I mean the line, the first letter has lost its old sound. It's in Latin. I'm reading it as a way. The first letter has lost its old sound. And he goes on like this. I could continue. I'm going to stop just because I want to tell you what happened with Alexander Dumas, what he claims happened. People know who he is, right? Alexander Dumas was an author. He wrote The Three Musketeers. He is descended from a great general of African descent, Alexander Dumas, who was his father. The father led what was called the American Brigade, which was called that because they were from Haiti, and they were black. And he was incarcerated, the father, to prevent him from assuming control of the French military at the point that Napoleon assumed control. Dumas wrote a book about this called The Count of Monte Cristo. His father is the protagonist in that book. And so Alexander Dumas was a part of Lafayette's sort of Society of Cincinnati, I'll put it like that. And I'm sorry, I have to try to find where, oh, here it is. This Dumas, that's by the first peasants, okay. Here it is. So here's the letter, which was written by Alexander Dumas, which everybody claimed, many people claim is false, not true. But he did write the letter. The only question is he making something up? So nobody's saying that he didn't write the letter, he's saying he was exaggerating. You know, it was about the year 1832. So Poe would have been 23 years old. One day, an American presented himself at my house with an introduction from his fellow American, James Fenimore Cooper. I should also let's say that Cooper accompanied Lafayette on the tour when he was here in 1824 and was said to be the actual chronicler of the whole tour. So he's never mentioned, and Levasseur only references him once or twice in his book, but that's important to know also. Start again. I was about the year 1832. One day, an American presented himself at my house with an introduction from his fellow American, James Fenimore Cooper. Needless to say, I welcomed him with open arms. Needless to say, American came to your house because he got a letter from Cooper. That's why. His name was Edgar Poe. Notice, not Edgar Allan Poe. His name was Edgar Poe. That's because he would have given him his name. From the outset, I realized that I had to deal with a remarkable man. 2 or 3 remarks which he made upon my furniture, the things I had about me, the way my articles of everyday use were strewn about the room, and on my moral and intellectual characteristics, impressed me with their accuracy and truth. On the very first day of our acquaintance, I freely proffered him my friendship and asked for his. He must certainly have entertained for me a sympathy similar to that I felt for him, for he held out his hand to me, and the understanding between us was instantaneous and complete. At this time, my mother's ill health required that she enjoy purer air than that afforded by the more central parts of Paris. She was living in the Luxembourg district, while I had a little house all to myself in the Rue de l'Ouest, West Street. I offered to let Poe have 2 rooms in this house for the duration of his stay in Paris. Edgar Poe accepted my offer, confessing that his financial resources amounted to little more than 300 francs a month, accruing to him on a credit from Monsieur Lafitte. Only he made his acceptance conditional on one essential stipulation, which was that in his mode of life, under my roof, he should be free to do entirely as he wished, and to comport himself as if the house was his and not mine. From the very first day of our association, I realized why he laid down the conditions to which I have referred. Poe had one curious idiosyncrasy. He liked the night better than the day. Indeed, his love of darkness amounted to a passion, but the goddess of night could not always afford him her shade and remained with him continually, so he contrived a substitute. As soon as day began to break, he hermetically sealed up the windows in his room and lit a couple of candles. In the midst of this pale illumination, he worked or read or suffered his thoughts to wander in the insubstantial regions of reveries. Or else he fell asleep, not being always able to indulge in waking dreams. But as soon as the clock told him darkness had come, he would come in for me and take me out with him if I was there, or go forth alone if I were not. As a general rule, I must confess, I was ready and waiting for him, for these nocturnal expeditions in his company were a source of veritable pleasure. In these rambles, I could not help remarking with wonder and admiration, though his rich endowment of ideas should have prepared me for it, on the extraordinary faculty of analysis exhibited by my friend. He seemed to delight in giving it play and neglected no opportunity to indulge himself in that pleasure. He made no secret of the enjoyment he derived from it, and would remark with a smile of proud satisfaction that for him, every man had an open window where his heart was. And as a rule, he accompanied that assertion with an immediate demonstration, which, having me for its object, could leave no doubt in my mind concerning Edgar's power of divination. So the thought is that this story, Murders in the Rue Morgue, is Poe writing about his nighttime walks with Alexander Dumas.
What would be the reasoning behind wanting to make that letter, give it that it's fake, that it's not real?
Because if it's real, Poe was in Europe. And if Poe was in Europe, with a letter from James Fenimore Cooper, he was a different person entirely than he was represented. Because he was represented as a drunk or a drug addict or, kind of a screwball. Right? And if he couldn't have it, he wouldn't have had a letter to Dumas, except as a representative of the Society of the Cincinnati.
Right.
And he would have been
France.
23 years old. That's right.
It's France, right? It's not like,
That's France.
It's an important relationship with America.
It's more than important. It's the critical relationship with America. I mean,
Yeah.
France, there's no America without France.
Right.
Doesn't exist. And there's another element. You got to remember that in the original American Revolution, you got Pulaski and Kosciuszko from Poland. And of course, you have everybody from France, all sorts of people from there, Rochambeau, Vergennes, Lafayette. I mean, you can just keep going on that. And you have people also from Spain, because Carlos III supported the American Revolution. It's people from there. It's all the people around Goya. Several of those people were supporters of the American Revolution.
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, I just thought then, like, what was Gouverneur Morris doing in France during the French Revolution, and what was laid there too? Because he was,
Well, that Lynn would have to come back to that. That's John Jay. See, John Jay was the head of Washington's spy network in New York. John Jay is a close friend of Alexander Hamilton, but the closest friend is Gouverneur Morris, who you're referring to. He becomes the envoy to France. Okay. Now Jefferson's there too. Jefferson's got another thing happening. We all know, or should know, because he spent a lot of time with Sally Hemings, among other things. And he's also, Jefferson is very much he is pro-Jacobin. Okay?
Jefferson.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. And Washington and Hamilton are not having it. Okay? Washington and Hamilton are saying, listen, this is not the same as our revolution. I mean, there's a big faction of Franklins that's there. And there was, of course, Lafayette who was there. But problem was that the execution of the king, which had not happened initially, I'm not saying, but that tendency, that whole business, the Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette had both supported the American Revolution. Now, I'm not telling you that was at any great depth because, when Franklin met them, Louis was about 23, 24. And Marie Antoinette was like 17, 18 years old. So Franklin was 70. And Franklin comes in and he's got this coonskin hat and this whole thing. He's doing a whole America thing, he's like the native, he is the Rousseau noble savage. He's coming from the wilds of America. And so he creates this whole scene around him in France. And there's a few older guys like Vergennes or Beaumarchais, who wrote The Marriage of Figaro. Beaumarchais is a big supporter of the Americans. He's raising money for them.
He did the libretto.
Beaumarchais wrote the book in the first place. Right. And there's a libretto. Yeah, he worked. Lorenzo da Ponte works on the libretto, but with Beaumarchais. But what I'm saying is Beaumarchais creates a company. What the hell's the name? I'll come in a minute. A special company, which is just a front for money for the American Revolution, which Vergennes, who's the French finance minister, is laundering money through. What they're doing with the play, The Marriage of Figaro, is they use the play to raise money, which they indirectly use for weapons. Now, that's not the only reason they're doing the play, but it's a good occasion. So there's a whole thing going on with France, which is a whole. So
yeah,
when you talk about Lafayette, and see, Lafayette is a teenager. I mean, he doesn't mean anything. He does what he does with Washington. But in France, Franklin had created this whole network. And Franklin was always doing this kind of stuff. He did it in Scotland. He did it in Ireland. He had networks in England. He had scientific networks too. Most of what Franklin did in the American Revolution has never been written. And much of it is not known. But so these were networks that were, and Lafayette was the inheritor of this because they were the major people, because they were opposed to the British. Right? They were opposed, that's who they lost the 7 Years' War to. And they completely financed the American Revolution, and the revenge against that was the British destabilization of the finances of France, which then got the whole thing cascading. Lafayette tried to make an arrangement with the monarchy. This was not maybe the smartest thing to do. And eventually the revolution turned, over a period of time into the terror.
Yeah.
Franklin's networks were killed. But some of them survived, and Dumas was the son of Alexander Dumas, they say the general. They were part of the revolution, but they were not Jacobins, okay? Just like Chevalier de Saint-Georges, the great swordsman, who was also the conductor of the Paris Opera, who was black, who helped Mozart. But he was a defender of the crown.
Really?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. See, so the history is not what you think in these things. But because what were they trying to do? They were trying to make a revolution, but they wanted the revolution. This is in Europe. This isn't across the whole ocean, right? Where you can just like have a democratic society. They knew there the problem was you had to have an orderly transition, because if you didn't do that, and it happened to France anyway, you get invaded by, in the case of France, 5 different armies, because everybody's got monarchies. So they were trying to navigate something.
Well, yeah, because I'm just thinking like it's 1832, right?
Yeah, that's
that
much
letter
later.
should- right. But that's 15 years or something after Bonaparte is like exile.
Well, 1812 to 15, Bonaparte is out.
right.
About
So it's
17
like,
years.
what reason would these American figures have to be in France if not to reconfigure what France is going to look like?
Remember that America is persona non grata. America is like to Europe, like what Cuba has been like to the United States.
At that time in 1830.
Oh, yeah. Sure. It stayed that way into the 1870s, 1880s.
When did that start?
Well, from the time they made the revolution, because they overthrew the king.
Well, wait, but I thought Europeans were like, oh, yeah, this is great.
Some of them.
Yeah, where you could be like that. I mean, come on, no, you couldn't even talk about these things in Europe, except under certain circumstances. In fact, that's what a lot of the Masonic societies were doing. Look at Mozart.
Right, it was Freemason.
Well, but the thing is that there were many people. So was Lafayette. I mean, Lafayette had an entire section of the Freemasons. Lafayette's the person that gave the blacks, Prince Hall in Massachusetts was black. He gave him a Masonic charter. That's why there are black Masons. But that's where they come from. Because what Lafayette was trying to do with his faction, which is partially supported by Washington. This is why if you talk to certain right-wingers in America, they talk to you about the Masonic conspiracy of the American Revolution, and that Franklin and Washington were Masons, and the whole thing was really, that's why they do that, because they were Masons. But what they were doing is that they were in an opposition to the Scottish Rite Freemasons, which is the British order. Now, Franklin, this is a long discussion about his infiltration of this stuff earlier. But what's relevant about what I'm saying here about the French side of it, and then Austrian side, which was where Mozart was a Mason. And there, they were the part of that was called the House of Wisdom or something like that, which is the Masonic grouping, which Baron von Swieten was in. It was headed by this guy named Solomon, who was black, who headed that group. He's the actual guy that Zoroastro from the Magic Flute. He's the model for him. So Mozart was in this as well, but he was in that circle because he supported that's why he wrote the music for Franklin's crazy music instrument, the glass harmonica. This thing that Franklin made, it was not so great, but Mozart wrote, there's a prelude and fugue for it and a few other pieces. But so that's how they did things.
Right.
You couldn't be openly revolutionary in Europe. I mean, that's what happened to Schiller.
Yeah.
Schiller wrote one play, right? The Robbers. And then after that, brother, he saw what they were going to begin to do was to shut him down. And they did. A friend of his named Schubart was a poet, was completely ruined, completely destroyed.
This is great. It's like so much is done. just in that period alone.
Well, yeah, but the thing is, that's what Poe is. So when you're talking about American intelligence, this is its actual origins. That's our argument. And what we have to do is to resurrect it. So we can do a lot more on this. I don't want
What's
to.
that period where Dumas is talking about?
That's 1832. Poe's 23 years old. And Dumas is about 35, I think. About that.
Because in the 1820s, that's when Cooper's there and
Yeah,
Morse
earlier.
is there and Lafayette.
Right.
They're all meeting together.
Yeah, well, yeah, because they're doing that, right? Because what's happening is Jefferson and John Adams are still alive, but they're going to die on the 4th of July,
Yeah.
exactly 50 years later,
Right.
right? On
Yeah,
1826. This is 1824 when Poe meets Lafayette.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's 2 years earlier. And what they're doing is they're trying to get John Quincy Adams elected.
Yeah.
Because John Quincy Adams is the last one of their guys. Because John Quincy Adams was born in 1767, and he became a spy when he was 8 years old. So he was a spy in the courts of France. Okay, you can read little things from him. I have little things where he was writing from when he's 8 years old. He's writing descriptions for that. Okay? Quincy Adams, of course, was one of the most educated people around. He knew like 7 different languages. He'd been the ambassador to Russia. He'd written the famous Monroe Doctrine and so on. They were trying to get him in. So that's what they did. But they were also at the same time finishing like the Erie Canal project, which DeWitt Clinton was another member of the Society of Cincinnati. He had been the governor. He was also the mayor of New York City. They finished that project. Big opposition to that from Aaron Burr and from Gallatin and people like that. So when Lafayette came here, that's what they were doing. They were trying to finish these projects that Hamilton and Washington had started, because this thing was all one thing to them. And the question about slavery was the major thing on Lafayette's mind, because it had been the major thing on his mind when he was here in those discussions with Hamilton and company when he was 19 years old. So every place he went, Levasseur is just writing down, he agreed with Lafayette. So but when you're hearing those things, a few things I read to you, or anything else you get out of that book, that's what Lafayette thought. And they knew that most of the Americans, or many of the Americans, were screwed up on this. But they also knew that the commitment that the revolution had was to abolish this. They also knew that not everybody in the revolution had that commitment. It's just some of them had the commitment, like anything else. And so the issue of the United States of that time and 50 years later was that it was this whole evolving process, the more perfect union process. And what has happened is, in the war in which Lincoln had 1861 to 65, that's the point at which this thing had to be resolved by a bloody internal conflict. But it was only partially resolved by the bloody internal conflict. Then King had to do something different. So anyway, that's just what it is. So yeah, I mean, a lot of this, I'm not trying to cut on this because there's a lot of ways this can go, but yeah, this is the real history. I say it's real, I say, well, because you say it's real? No, look it up. We should be going to original sources. We're going to find a lot more than the stuff I've indicated. That's the reason for resurrecting the project against these crazies and knuckle draggers and just whatever you want to call them, weirdos that are in the American intelligence establishment today.
Are we still in the public thing? Or?
Yeah, we're still alive.
Garland Nixon was called. We better talk.
Okay, all right. All right,
That's all right. Yeah,
it's all right.
Probably get.
Okay, we don't have
Well,
an
we
end.
got an end card.
We do?
Yeah, it's right over there.
Oh, the vote for combo?
Oh yeah, Garland. If you want.
Can you just hold that up?
Yeah, we're good. Just put that up.
Here you go. We have an end card now.
All right, this is the end.
Here we go.
That's the end.